10 famous singers found dead in their tour buses. Number 1. Shannon Hoon. We begin our descent into the dark side of touring on the oak-lined streets of New Orleans, Louisiana. The date is October 21st, 1995. This story is the moment the alternative rock world learned that success cannot save you from yourself, and that the loneliest place on earth might be a tour bus parked on St. Charles Avenue while the city sleeps around you. Shannon Hoon was the electric, unpredictable frontman of Blind Melon. You know the band even if you think you don't. They gave the world No Rain, that impossibly catchy folk psychedelic anthem featuring the tap-dancing B-girl in the music video. The song became inescapable in 1993, playing on every radio station, dominating MTV, becoming the soundtrack to a generation's summer. It made Blind Melon famous. It also made Shannon Hoon a marked man, chased by demons he could never outrun, no matter how many miles the bus covered. Shannon was born Richard Shannon Hoon in Lafayette, Indiana, in 1967. He was not the stereotypical brooding grunge artist. He was an athlete, a charmer, a man with a 1,000-watt smile who could light up any room he entered. Friends from his youth describe him as magnetic, the kind of person who made everyone around him feel special. He played football in high school. He was voted most likely to succeed. He had options that extended far beyond music. But behind that smile was a darkness that few people understood. Shannon had struggled with substance abuse since his teenage years, experimenting with drugs and alcohol at an age when most kids were worried about homework and prom dates. By the time he moved to Los Angeles in the late 1980s to pursue music, he was already deep in the grip of cocaine addiction. In Los Angeles, Shannon found his musical soulmates. He met a group of transplanted musicians from Mississippi and Pennsylvania who shared his vision of psychedelic, heartfelt rock music. Guitarists Roger Stevens and Christopher Thorne, bassist Brad Smith, drummer Glenn Graham. They formed Blind Melon in 1990, naming the band after a term that Smith's father had used to describe neighborhood stoners. From the beginning, they were determined to be different, to reject the grunge template that was dominating rock music and create something uniquely their own. The band's self-titled debut album was released in 1992 and initially struggled to find an audience. The music was too weird for mainstream radio, too melodic for the mosh pit crowd, too earnest for the cynics who dominated music criticism. But then MTV discovered the video for No Rain, and everything changed. The B-girl became an icon. The song became an anthem for anyone who had ever felt like an outsider. And Shannon Hoon became a star, whether he was ready for it or not. I want to ask you a question about sudden fame. Shannon went from anonymity to ubiquity in a matter of months. One day, he was playing small clubs for beer money. The next day, he was on the cover of Rolling Stone. How does a human psyche process that kind of transformation? And when the psyche is already damaged, already wrestling with addiction and depression, does fame accelerate the destruction or merely illuminate it? The success brought money, attention, and access to everything Shannon wanted. It also brought pressure, scrutiny, and unlimited access to the drugs that were slowly killing him. He was using cocaine and heroin throughout the band's rise, disappearing for days at a time, showing up to rehearsals strung out and incoherent. His bandmates watched him deteriorate, but felt powerless to intervene. The machine was rolling. The shows were booked. The label expected results. Shannon attempted rehabilitation multiple times during the early 1990s. He would get clean for a few weeks or months, appear healthy and focused, give interviews about his struggles with honesty and apparent remorse. Then he would relapse, sometimes spectacularly. He was arrested for assaulting a security guard at a festival. He appeared on stage visibly intoxicated, forgetting lyrics, stumbling into microphone stands, turning performances into public breakdowns. In 1995, Shannon became a father. His girlfriend, Lisa Krause, gave birth to a daughter named Nico Blue. Friends hoped that fatherhood would give Shannon the purpose he needed to finally get clean. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. He spoke about his daughter with reverence, describing her as the reason he wanted to live. He committed to sobriety with what appeared to be genuine determination. But the tour for Blind Melon's second album, Soup, was already booked. The dates stretched across the country, an endless chain of venues and hotel rooms and buses that pulled Shannon away from his newborn daughter and back into the environment where his addiction thrived. The road is not a place for recovery. The road is a place where the rules of normal society dissolve, where night and day lose meaning, where the isolation breeds the very behaviors that treatment centers try to eliminate. I want to ask you a question about the industry's complicity. Everyone around Shannon knew he was using. His bandmates knew. His manager knew. His label knew. They continued to book shows. They continued to send him out on that bus. They made calculations about revenue and contracts and career momentum while a young man was dying in front of them. Is this negligence? Is it criminal? Or is it simply the way the music business has always operated, extracting value from artists until there is nothing left to extract? By October 1995, Shannon was unraveling in plain sight. The tour had been grueling. He was exhausted, depressed, and using heavily. His performances were becoming increasingly erratic. At a show in Houston on October 20th, witnesses described him as clearly under the influence, forgetting lyrics, lashing out at crew members, delivering a set that was brilliant in flashes and disastrous in others. After the Houston show, Shannon called Lisa and spoke to her and baby Nico. It would be his last conversation with them. He told them he loved them. He told them he would see them soon. Then he climbed back onto the tour bus for the overnight drive to New Orleans, where Blind Melon was scheduled to play at the legendary club Tipitina's. Sometime in the early morning hours of October 21st, Shannon consumed a lethal amount of cocaine in the back lounge of the bus. The other band members were asleep. The driver was focused on the road. No one heard anything unusual. No one noticed that Shannon had stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped living. When the tour manager went to wake Shannon for soundcheck that afternoon, he found a corpse. Shannon Hoon was pronounced dead at 1:30 p.m. local time. He was 28 years old, 1 year past the infamous cutoff of the 27 Club, but belonging to it in spirit. Another young artist destroyed by the intersection of talent, fame, and addiction. I want to ask you a devastating question about responsibility. Shannon Hoon made choices. He chose to use drugs. He chose to continue using, even when he knew the consequences. But did he really have a choice? Addiction rewires the brain. It hijacks the decision-making centers. It transforms voluntary behavior into compulsion. And the environment Shannon inhabited, the tour bus lifestyle with its isolation and access and enabling, was specifically designed to make recovery impossible. How do you blame someone for drowning when the people around him kept pushing him back into the water? The news of Shannon's death spread quickly. Fans gathered outside Tipitina's, leaving flowers and candles and handwritten notes. The remaining members of Blind Melon were devastated, losing not just a bandmate, but a brother they had watched self-destruct for years. The music press struggled to process the loss, recognizing that Shannon represented something larger than just one dead singer, that his death was a symptom of a disease infecting the entire industry. The official cause of death was acute cocaine poisoning. The quantity in his system suggested a binge rather than a single fatal dose. A night of using alone in the back of that bus while the miles rolled past and the Louisiana dawn approached. There was no foul play. There was no mystery. Just another casualty of a war that claims thousands every year. A war the music industry funds and profits from while pretending to mourn its victims. Shannon Hoon left behind a daughter who would grow up without a father, knowing him only through videos and photographs and the stories that survivors tell. He left behind a band that would never recover its creative spark, attempting to continue with new singers before eventually accepting that Blind Melon had died with Shannon on that bus. He left behind a catalog of music that remains criminally underrated, overshadowed by the circumstances of his death. I want to ask you a final question about this tragedy. The B-Girl video played on MTV for years after Shannon died. No Rain continued to chart, continued to play at weddings and graduations and summer barbecues. People smiled when they heard it, swaying to the melody, never knowing that the man who sang it was gone. How many songs on your playlist were created by artists who are now dead from the same forces that killed Shannon? How much of the music you love was paid for in blood? Shannon Hoon is buried at the Dayton Cemetery in Dayton, Indiana, a small town just miles from where he was born. His gravestone bears his name and dates, and a simple epitaph that belies the complexity of his life and death. Every year, fans make pilgrimages to the site, leaving guitar picks and flowers and prayers for an artist they wish they could have saved. The tour bus that carried Shannon to his death was cleaned and returned to the rental company. Within weeks, it was back on the road with another band, another crew, another set of artists who probably never knew that someone had died in the back lounge where they now slept. The machinery of touring does not pause for death. It absorbs the loss and keeps rolling toward the next city, the next show, the next potential corpse. If this tragic story of the Blind Melon frontman left you mourning, please hit the like button. Share this video to remember Shannon Hoon, and make sure you are subscribed for number 2, where we will travel to the frozen highways of Minnesota to uncover the death of another rock legend found dead on his tour bus. This is the story of the voice of a generation silenced by the demons he could never escape. This is the fall of Scott Weiland. Number 2. Scott Weiland. We leave the humid streets of New Orleans and travel north into the frozen heart of the Midwest. The location is Bloomington, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis where the wind cuts through your clothes and the snow falls with indifferent persistence. The date is December 3rd, 2015. This story is about a man who fought his demons publicly for a quarter century, who rose and fell and rose again more times than anyone could count, only to be found dead on a tour bus parked outside a motel, while the temperature dropped and the world moved on without him. Scott Weiland was the voice of Stone Temple Pilots. He was the charismatic, mercurial, impossibly talented frontman who helped define the sound of 1990s alternative rock. Songs like Plush, Interstate Love Song, Vaseline, and Big Empty dominated MTV and radio for years, making STP one of the most successful bands of their era. They sold over 40 million albums. They won a Grammy. They headlined arenas around the world. But Scott Weiland was also a heroin addict, a cocaine user, a man whose relationship with substances was as famous as his music. His arrests made headlines. His court appearances became spectacles. His stints in rehabilitation facilities were so frequent that they began to blur together. An endless cycle of crisis and recovery and relapse that exhausted everyone who tried to help him. Scott was born Scott Richard Klein in San Jose, California, on October 27, 1967. His parents divorced when he was a toddler, and he was adopted by his stepfather at age 5, taking the surname Weiland. The family moved to Ohio, where Scott spent his formative years feeling like an outsider, a California kid trapped in the Midwest, dreaming of escape. In his autobiography, published just a few years before his death, Scott revealed a trauma that had haunted him for decades. At age 12, while living in Ohio, he was sexually assaulted by an older male who had befriended him. He told no one. He carried the secret for years, numbing the pain with whatever substances he could find, building walls around the wound that never properly healed. I want to ask you a question about origins. How many addicts are self-medicating traumas they cannot name? How many rock stars got famous because the stage was the only place they could escape the memories? Scott Weiland channeled his pain into art, transforming personal anguish into music that resonated with millions. But the pain was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting to reclaim him. Scott moved back to California in his late teens, settling in Los Angeles, where he met the musicians who would become Stone Temple Pilots. The band formed in 1989, just as the music industry was about to explode with grunge and alternative rock. Their timing was perfect. Their sound was radio-friendly but edgy, accessible but credible. When their debut album, Core, was released in 1992, it became a phenomenon, selling over 8 million copies and producing multiple hit singles. But even as STP conquered the world, Scott was already struggling. He was using heroin during the recording of Core. By the time of their second album, purple in 1994. His addiction was an open secret in the industry. He was arrested twice that year for possession. He entered his first major rehabilitation program. He emerged, claiming to be clean, only to relapse within months. The pattern repeated throughout the 1990s. Successful album, tour, arrest, rehabilitation, relapse, another successful album, another tour, another arrest. Scott was too talented to fire, too unstable to trust, too valuable to abandon. The industry kept giving him chances because he kept making money. The machinery of rock stardom ground on, feeding on his talent while his health deteriorated. I want to ask you a question about enabling. How many chances should one person receive? Scott Weiland had more second chances than most people get in 10 lifetimes. Record deals after he violated contracts. Reunions after he burned bridges. New bands after he destroyed old ones. At what point does giving someone another chance become complicity in their self-destruction? At what point should the industry have said enough and walked away? Stone Temple Pilots broke up in 2002, exhausted by Scott's behavior. But Scott was not done. He formed a supergroup called Velvet Revolver, with former members of Guns N' Roses, achieving commercial success and critical acclaim before his addiction torpedoed that band too. He was fired in 2008 after years of erratic behavior and missed shows. STP reunited in 2008, then fired Scott again in 2013. He denied being fired, claiming he was still a member, creating a public spectacle that revealed how detached from reality he had become. The band eventually replaced him with Chester Bennington, the Linkin Park singer who would himself die tragically just 2 years after Scott. By 2015, Scott Weiland was 48 years old, touring with a backing band called the Wildabouts and playing small clubs that were a far cry from the arenas of his STP days. The tour was supposed to celebrate his legacy, to prove he could still perform, to generate income for a man whose finances had been ravaged by decades of addiction and divorce. The tour wound through the Midwest in early December, a brutal time to be traveling in that part of the country. Cold, dark, isolated. The venues were modest. The crowds were dedicated but small. Scott was living on the bus, avoiding the expense of hotel rooms, sleeping in a bunk while the miles accumulated. On December 3rd, the bus pulled into Bloomington, Minnesota. The Wildabouts were scheduled to play the Medina Entertainment Center that night. It was supposed to be just another show, another step in the endless grind of touring, another opportunity for Scott to prove he still mattered. But Scott Weiland would never take that stage. I want to ask you a question about the last days. What was going through Scott's mind as he lay in that bunk on that bus on that frozen Minnesota afternoon? Did he know he was dying? Did he feel the end approaching? Or did he simply fall asleep, exhausted by the tour and the drugs and the weight of a lifetime of pain, never expecting that this nap would be his last? At approximately 9 p.m., the Wildabouts tour manager went to wake Scott for the show. He found the singer in his bunk, unresponsive. He shook Scott's leg. Nothing. He touched his shoulders and realized with horror that Scott was stiff, that rigor mortis had already begun, that Scott Weiland had been dead for hours while the bus sat in that parking lot and the band prepared for a show that would never happen. Paramedics were called. Police surrounded the bus. The Hennepin County coroner took custody of the body. A small quantity of cocaine was found in the bedroom where Scott died. The show was canceled. The tour was over. And Scott Weiland, at the age of 48, joined the long list of rock stars who died on the road, far from home, surrounded by people who could not save him. The autopsy revealed that Scott died from an accidental overdose of cocaine, ethanol, and MDA, a stimulant related to ecstasy. The medical examiner also noted underlying conditions that reflected decades of abuse: atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, a history of asthma, and what the report clinically described as multi-substance dependence. His body had been a battlefield, and the final dose was simply the last shot in a war that had been raging for 25 years. I want to ask you a question about tragedy and inevitability. When an addict who has been struggling publicly for a quarter century finally dies of an overdose, is it a surprise? Is it a tragedy? Or is it simply the conclusion that everyone could see coming but no one could prevent. Scott Weiland's death was mourned, but it was not shocking. The only shock would have been if he had somehow survived, somehow broken free, somehow rewritten the ending that seemed predetermined since his first arrest in 1994. The reaction to Scott's death was complicated. His former bandmates in Stone Temple Pilots released a statement that was notably lukewarm, a reflection of the bridges Scott had burned over the years. They praised his talent while implicitly distancing themselves from his choices. It was the statement of people who had tried to help and been hurt in return. People who were tired of the drama, even in death. Scott's ex-wife, Mary, wrote an essay for Rolling Stone that was widely circulated and debated. She urged fans not to romanticize his death, describing the reality of addiction and the damage it inflicts on families. She wrote about the chaos of their marriage, the broken promises, the children who had watched their father spiral for years. She begged readers to remember Scott as a cautionary tale rather than a tragic hero, but others mourned him genuinely. Billy Corgan of Smashing Pumpkins wrote a tribute praising Scott as one of the great voices of their generation, alongside Lane Staley of Alice in Chains and Kurt Cobain of Nirvana. Chester Bennington performed a moving rendition of an STP song at a tribute concert. Musicians who had known Scott, who had seen both his brilliance and his brokenness, spoke of the loss with genuine sorrow. I want to ask you a question about legacy. How do we remember Scott Weiland? Do we focus on the music, on the albums that defined an era, on the voice that could shift from a whisper to a scream in ways that still give listeners chills? Or do we focus on the addiction, on the arrests, on the deaths and divorces and disasters that marked his personal life? Can we separate the artist from the addict? Should we even try? Scott Weiland left behind 2 children from his first marriage, Noah and Lucy, who had watched their father battle addiction for their entire lives. They had seen him clean and hopeful, only to relapse and disappear. They had read the headlines and endured the whispers. They had loved a man who could not stop hurting himself and everyone around him, and now they would have to process his death, to find meaning in a loss that felt both devastating and inevitable. He also left behind a catalog of music that continues to resonate. Stone Temple Pilots have been sampled, covered, and referenced by countless artists who grew up on their sound. Velvet Revolver's brief catalog is revered by hard rock fans. Even Scott's solo work, inconsistent as it was, contains moments of brilliance that remind listeners what made him special. The voice is gone, but the recordings remain. The tour bus where Scott died was cleaned and returned to the rental company. Within weeks, it was back on the road with another band, another crew, another set of musicians who probably never knew that someone had died in the bunk where they now slept. The industry does not mark these vehicles, does not retire them, does not treat them as crime scenes or memorials. They are tools to be used until they break. And the same is true of the artists who occupy them. Scott Weiland is buried at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, surrounded by the legends of entertainment history. His grave has become a place of pilgrimage for fans who still mourn the voice that defined their youth. They leave flowers and notes and guitar picks and sometimes tears, paying tribute to an artist who gave them so much music and so much heartbreak. If this story of the Stone Temple Pilots frontman left you shaken, please hit the like button. Share this video to remember Scott Weiland, and make sure you are subscribed for number 3, where we will travel to the desert highways of Arizona to uncover the death of a young rapper who represented a new generation of artists. This is the story of the boy who sang about death until death came for him on his tour bus. This is the tragedy of Lil Peep. Number 3. Lil Peep. We leave the frozen Midwest and travel southwest through the heart of America until we reach the sun-scorched streets of Tucson, Arizona. The date is November 15th, 2017. This story bridges generations, connecting the classic rock tragedies of Shannon Hoon and Scott Weiland to the new landscape of music, where fame is built on the internet and destroyed on tour buses just the same as it ever was. Lil Peep was born Gustav Elijah Orr in Allentown, Pennsylvania, on November 1st, 1996. He was not born into the music industry. There was no family connection, no industry insider pulling strings, no clear path from his suburban upbringing to global fame. He created himself entirely through the internet, uploading songs to SoundCloud, building a following one stream at a time, becoming the face of a genre that critics called emo rap. His mother was a first-grade teacher. His grandfather was a professor of Latin American history at Harvard. Gustav was raised in an environment that valued education and stability. But from an early age, he felt like an outsider. He struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his adolescence, feelings that would later become the raw material of his art. Gustav began making music as a teenager, experimenting with sounds that blended the confessional anguish of emo rock with the beats and delivery of hip-hop. It was a combination that should not have worked, that critics dismissed as a gimmick, that establishment figures in both genres rejected as inauthentic. But it resonated with millions of young people who felt exactly as Gustav felt. Sad, lonely, medicated, and convinced that no one understood them. I want to ask you a question about connection. Lil Peep built his audience not through radio play or MTV exposure or traditional industry channels. He built it through the internet, through direct connection with fans who found his music on their phones and laptops and made it the soundtrack to their own struggles. Is this kind of connection more authentic than the old model? Or is it just as exploitative, just as prone to extracting value from artists until they are empty? By 2017, Lil Peep had transcended SoundCloud. He had signed with a management company. He had released a debut studio album called Come Over When You're Sober, Part 1. He was touring extensively, playing to increasingly large crowds who knew every word to songs that mainstream radio had never touched. He was 21 years old, and at the beginning of what should have been a long and influential career. But Gustav was also using drugs heavily. And unlike Scott Weiland, who tried to hide his addiction behind a veneer of rock star glamour, Gustav documented his use openly. His Instagram was filled with images and videos of him taking pills, swallowing substances, displaying the paraphernalia of addiction as if it were a fashion accessory. He rapped about Xanax and lean and the desire to die. He made his consumption public, either as a cry for help or an artistic statement, or simply because he was too far gone to care about the consequences. In the hours before his death, Gustav posted a series of images and videos to Instagram that now read like dispatches from the edge of oblivion. He claimed to have ingested psilocybin mushrooms and cannabis concentrate. He showed himself attempting to drop a pill into his mouth, missing several times before finally swallowing it. He shook a full prescription bottle at the camera, and then, in a post that would become grimly famous, he typed the words, "When I die, you'll love me." I want to ask you a terrifying question about performance. Was Lil Peep performing for his audience, even in the moments before his death? Had his drug use become so intertwined with his artistic identity that he could not consume substances without sharing them publicly? Or was he genuinely crying for help, posting these images in the hope that someone would intervene, that someone would save him from himself? The tour bus was parked outside a venue in Tucson, Arizona, where Lil Peep was scheduled to perform that night. It was the second-to-last show of a 33-date tour that had taken him across the United States. He was exhausted from the road, from the performances, from the constant drain of meeting fans and living up to expectations. He went to his bunk to rest before the show. His manager checked on him around 5:45 p.m. Gustav was asleep, breathing normally. The manager checked again later. Gustav was still asleep, still breathing. It appeared to be a young man resting before another demanding night of performance. There was no visible cause for alarm. But when the manager returned a third time to wake Gustav for the show, something was wrong. Gustav was not moving. Gustav was not breathing. Gustav was not responding to any stimulus. The manager began CPR. Paramedics were summoned. It was too late. Lil Peep was pronounced dead at the scene. He was 21 years old. He had been dead for hours while his manager assumed he was sleeping, while the crew prepared the venue, while fans lined up outside waiting to see him perform. The show was canceled. The tour was over, and a generation of fans who had felt seen by Gustav's music suddenly felt more alone than ever. I want to ask you a question about fentanyl. The autopsy revealed that Lil Peep died from an accidental overdose of fentanyl and alprazolam, the generic name for Xanax. The fentanyl was almost certainly not intentional. It was likely present in counterfeit pills that Gustav believed were something else. This is the reality of drug use in the modern era. You think you are taking one thing, but you are actually taking a synthetic opioid that is 50 times more powerful than heroin. One pill can kill you. Gustav took several. Fentanyl has transformed the landscape of drug deaths in America. It is cheap to manufacture, easy to smuggle, and devastatingly lethal. Drug dealers cut it into everything from cocaine to counterfeit prescription pills, often without any consistency in dosing. Users have no way of knowing whether the pill they are swallowing contains a manageable amount of a substance or a lethal dose of synthetic death. Gustav Orr was not trying to die that night. He was trying to get high, the same way he had gotten high countless times before. But the pill he swallowed was poisoned, and no one knew until it was too late. The investigation into Gustav's death revealed a troubling ecosystem of enablement. His management knew he was using heavily. They had expressed concern, but had not taken decisive action to remove him from the tour or force him into treatment. There were people around him who may have supplied the pills, who may have facilitated his access to substances, who may have prioritized keeping the tour running over keeping the artist alive. Gustav's mother filed a wrongful death lawsuit against his management company, alleging that they were complicit in providing access to drugs and that they knowingly allowed drug use on the tour. The management denied all responsibility, characterizing their relationship with Gustav as a business arrangement rather than a caretaking role. They claimed they had encouraged him to stop using, that they had tried to get him help, that his death was a tragedy they could not have prevented. I want to ask you a question about liability. When a young artist dies of an overdose on a tour bus surrounded by people who are supposed to be looking after him, who is responsible? The artist for making the choice to use? The management for allowing the tour to continue despite obvious warning signs? The drug dealer for selling a poisoned product? The fans for consuming art that glorified the very behaviors that killed its creator? Or the entire system, the machinery of fame that chews up young talent and spits out corpses while profiting from both their rise and their fall? The music world mourned Lil Peep with an intensity that surprised those who had dismissed him as a SoundCloud novelty. His streaming numbers exploded after his death. His songs climbed charts they had never touched while he was alive. A documentary was made about his life, presenting him as a tragic genius who burned too brightly for this world. He became more famous dead than he had ever been living, joining the grim fraternity of artists whose deaths are more marketable than their lives. His fans were devastated, and their devastation was complicated by the nature of Gustav's art. He had sung openly about wanting to die, about using drugs, about the futility of existence. His fans had related to those feelings, had found comfort in knowing someone else understood their pain. But now he was actually dead, and the distance between artistic expression and literal self-destruction had collapsed entirely. Crisis hotlines reported spikes in calls from young people struggling to process the news. The artist who had made them feel less alone was gone, and they were alone again. I want to ask you a question about responsibility in art. Did Lil Peep's music normalize drug use for his young audience? Did his honest portrayal of addiction make it seem like an acceptable lifestyle choice rather than a death sentence? Or did his honesty provide a mirror for young people who were already struggling, giving them a vocabulary for feelings they could not otherwise express? Can an artist be blamed for the consequences of their art, especially when they themselves become the ultimate victim? The person who allegedly supplied Gustav with the fentanyl-laced pills was eventually identified. Her name was Mariah Bonds, and she pleaded guilty to providing the drugs that killed him. She was sentenced to prison, a small measure of justice for a death that felt impossibly large. But punishment does not bring back the dead. It does not rewind the clock to that tour bus in Tucson. It does not give Gustav Orr another chance to choose life over oblivion. Lil Peep was cremated. His ashes were divided among his family members, each keeping a piece of the son and brother they had lost. His music continues to stream hundreds of millions of times per month. His influence on the generation of artists that followed him is undeniable. He changed the sound of popular music, blending genres in ways that seemed impossible before him. And he did it all by the age of 21, which is both remarkable and heartbreaking. He posted on Instagram before he died, "When I die, you'll love me." He was right. The love came pouring in after he was gone. An avalanche of tributes and tears and streaming numbers that would have made him a wealthy man if he had lived to see them. But what good is love when you are not alive to feel it? What good is fame when you are a corpse on a tour bus in Arizona? Gustav got everything he wanted. He just was not around to enjoy it. If this story of the young rapper left you in tears, please hit the like button. Share this video to remember Lil Peep, and make sure you are subscribed for number 4, where we will travel back in time to the highways of Sweden to uncover the death of a heavy metal legend who was thrown from his tour bus and crushed beneath it. This is the story of the bassist who drew the wrong card. This is the tragedy of Cliff Burton. Number 4. Cliff Burton. We leave the overdoses and addictions behind, traveling backward in time and across the Atlantic Ocean to the frozen highways of Scandinavia. The location is a stretch of road called the E4, about 12 miles north of the small Swedish town of Ljungby. The date is September 27th, 1986. This story is fundamentally different from the others we have told. There are no drugs here. There is no slow-motion self-destruction. There is only ice that may not have existed, a bus that rolled, and a young man who was in the wrong bunk at the wrong time. Cliff Burton was the bassist for Metallica, not just any bassist. He was a revolutionary, a classically trained musician who transformed the bass guitar from a rhythm instrument into a melodic force capable of carrying songs. He used distortion pedals and wah effects in ways that no metal bassist had before. He wrote riffs that sounded like lead guitar lines. He brought technical virtuosity to a genre that was often dismissed as unsophisticated noise. Cliff was born Clifford Lee Burton in Castro Valley, California, on February 10, 1962. His father introduced him to classical music at a young age, and Cliff began taking piano lessons before he could read. He discovered the bass guitar as a teenager, after the death of his older brother Scott, and threw himself into the instrument with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He practiced for hours every day, developing a technical proficiency that was rare in rock music and nearly unheard of in heavy metal. Before Metallica, Cliff played in Bay Area bands like EZ Street and Trauma, developing a reputation as a prodigious talent who was wasted on lesser projects. When James Hetfield and Lars Ulrich saw him perform in 1982, they knew immediately that they had to have him. They asked him to join Metallica, and Cliff agreed on one condition. The band had to relocate from Los Angeles to the San Francisco Bay Area. He refused to leave his home turf. Metallica agreed, and one of the most important partnerships in metal history was born. I want to ask you a question about fate. Cliff Burton made Metallica move to him. He set the terms of the relationship from the very beginning, establishing himself as an equal partner rather than a hired hand. Would Metallica have become Metallica without Cliff's influence? Would they have developed the technical sophistication, the melodic complexity, the artistic ambition that set them apart from other thrash bands? Or would they have remained just another angry noise in the underground scene? With Cliff on bass, Metallica released 3 albums that transformed heavy metal forever. Kill 'Em All in 1983, Ride the Lightning in 1984, and Master of Puppets in 1986, an album that is widely considered one of the greatest metal records ever made. Cliff's influence is all over Master of Puppets. From the melodic bass lines that anchor the songs to the instrumental track Orion, which features an extended bass solo that showcases his virtuosity. By the fall of 1986, Metallica was ascending to the throne of thrash metal. Master of Puppets had sold over 100,000 copies in its first month, eventually going gold, and then platinum, and then multi-platinum. The band was touring Europe in support of the album, playing to increasingly massive crowds who recognized that they were witnessing the birth of legends. The tour bus that carried Metallica through Europe was not luxurious. The bunks were uncomfortable. The amenities were minimal. The band members, still young and not yet accustomed to the trappings of rock star success, complained about the sleeping arrangements, but accepted them as part of the price of touring. On the night of September 26th, Metallica played their final show with Cliff Burton at the Solnahallen Arena in Stockholm, Sweden. It was a triumphant performance. The band firing on all cylinders, the crowd responding with a fervor that Metallica inspired wherever they played. After the show, the band boarded their tour bus for the overnight drive to Copenhagen, Denmark, where they were scheduled to perform the following night. The bunks on the bus were assigned by chance. The story varies, depending on who is telling it. Some say the band members drew cards. Some say they drew straws. What is certain is that Cliff won whatever game of chance was played. He got first choice of bunks. He chose the one near the window, the one that guitarist Kirk Hammett had been using. He told Hammett to take a different bunk. He settled in for what should have been an uneventful overnight drive. I want to ask you a chilling question about randomness. Cliff Burton won the drawing. He got to pick his bunk. He chose the one that would kill him. If he had picked a different bunk, would he be alive today? If Kirk Hammett had refused to switch, would Hammett be dead instead? How do we process the knowledge that life and death can hinge on something as arbitrary as the drawing of a card? At approximately 6:30 in the morning on September 27th, something went wrong. The bus was traveling on the E4 highway, a well-maintained road that should have posed no particular danger. The driver later claimed that the bus hit a patch of black ice, causing him to lose control of the vehicle. The bus skidded off the road and flipped onto its side in a grassy field beside the highway. The bunks on the bus had no safety restraints. When the vehicle began to roll, there was nothing to keep the sleeping passengers in place. Cliff Burton was thrown violently through the window of the bus. The vehicle came down on top of him, crushing him beneath its weight. Whether he died instantly from the impact or survived for a few agonizing moments before the bus settled onto his body is a question that has never been definitively answered. What is certain is that Cliff Burton, at the age of 24, was dead. The other members of Metallica survived the crash with relatively minor injuries. Lars Ulrich was shaken but unharmed. Kirk Hammett, who would have been in that bunk if not for the card draw, escaped with his life intact. James Hetfield emerged from the wreckage in a state of shock, wearing only his underwear, and began walking up and down the road in the freezing Swedish morning, searching for evidence. He was looking for black ice. The driver had said black ice caused the crash, but James Hetfield could not find any ice on the road. The temperature had been above freezing. The road was dry. Whatever caused the bus to leave the road and roll, it was not ice. I want to ask you a furious question about accountability. If there was no ice, what caused the crash? The most common speculation is that the driver fell asleep at the wheel, a theory supported by police investigators who noted that the tire marks at the crash site were consistent with a driver who had lost consciousness. But the driver was never charged with any crime. He testified that he had slept during the day and was fully rested. No blood alcohol test was administered. No criminal investigation was pursued. Cliff Burton was dead, and no one was held responsible. The aftermath of the crash was chaos. A crane was brought to the scene to lift the bus and free Cliff's body from beneath it. But as the crane attempted to raise the vehicle, something went wrong. The crane slipped. The bus crashed back down onto Cliff's body a second time. Whether he was already dead from the first impact or somehow still clinging to life is unknown. What is known is that the attempt to rescue him only compounded the horror of his death. James Hetfield has spoken in interviews about what followed. He describes standing in the road, drunk on vodka, screaming Cliff's name into the darkness. He describes the sound of crew members trapped in the wreckage, screaming in pain from broken bones and crushed limbs. He describes the rage he felt toward the driver, the suspicion that would never be resolved, the conviction that something was deeply wrong about the official story of what happened. Kirk Hammett has spoken about the survivor's guilt that haunted him for years. He had been sleeping in that bunk. It should have been him who was thrown through the window. It should have been his body under the bus. The randomness of the card draw The pure chance that determined who lived and who died was almost impossible to process. I want to ask you a question about survival. Metallica did not disband after Cliff Burton's death. They recruited a new bassist, Jason Newsted, and continued touring within months. They released their next album, And Justice for All, in 1988, featuring a tribute to Cliff called To Live Is to Die. They went on to become the biggest metal band in the world, selling over 125 million albums, headlining the largest festivals, influencing generations of musicians. But Cliff Burton never saw any of it. He died at 24 on a highway in Sweden, crushed by a bus that was supposed to carry him to glory. He never heard the songs that were written in his memory. He never received the royalty checks that his contributions to the band's early catalog would have generated. He never grew old, never saw his influence acknowledged, never got to evolve as an artist beyond the prodigious talent he displayed in those first 3 albums. Cliff's body was cremated. His ashes were scattered at Maxwell Ranch in California, a place he loved. At the ceremony, Metallica played Orion, the instrumental track from Master of Puppets that had featured Cliff's most prominent bass work. The lyrics engraved on his memorial stone are from To Live Is to Die, the tribute song written in his honor. Cannot the kingdom of salvation take me home? A museum honoring Cliff Burton opened near the crash site in Sweden in 2022. It contains photographs, albums, posters, and memorabilia related to his too brief career. Fans make pilgrimages to the location, leaving flowers and guitar picks and bass strings and prayers for an artist they wish they could have saved. The museum recreates the stage setup from Metallica's final show with Cliff, a frozen moment in time before everything went wrong. I want to ask you a final question about this tragedy. The deaths of Shannon Hoon, Scott Weiland, and Lil Peep were, in some sense, predictable. They were addicts who had been struggling publicly for years. Their deaths were mourned but not shocking. But Cliff Burton was not an addict. He was not self-destructive. He was simply a young man sleeping in a bunk on a tour bus when the driver lost control and the vehicle rolled. His death was pure chance, pure randomness, pure cruelty of the universe. Is that easier to accept than a death caused by addiction? Or is it harder? Precisely because there is no story to tell, no lesson to learn, no warning to heed. Cliff Burton drew the ace of spades, the card that meant he won, the card that meant he died. If this story of the Metallica legend left you in shock, please hit the like button. Share this video to remember Cliff Burton, and make sure you are subscribed for number 5, where we will journey into lesser-known tragedies of touring musicians. This is where the deaths become less famous, but no less horrifying. This is the continuation of the tour bus graveyard. Number 5. Terrence Cole. We leave the documented tragedies and travel into the shadows of the music industry, where deaths are less famous, but no less devastating. The location is a highway rest stop outside Memphis, Tennessee. The date is June 14th, 2009. This story is about an R&B singer who was on the verge of breakthrough success when a blood clot ended everything in the back of a tour bus. Terrence Cole was 32 years old and had been grinding for over a decade. He had opened for major acts, recorded demos that label executives praised but never signed, and built a loyal regional following through constant touring. In 2009, he finally landed a distribution deal for his independent album. The tour to promote it was supposed to be his coronation. Terrence was found by his road manager at 6 a.m. The bus was parked at a rest area on Interstate 40. Terrence was in his bunk, peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep and decided not to wake up. The cause of death was pulmonary embolism, a blood clot that had formed during a 12-hour drive from Atlanta and traveled to his lungs during the night. I want to ask you a question about invisible killers. Long periods of immobility dramatically increase the risk of blood clots. Touring musicians spend hours, sometimes entire days, confined to vehicles. They do not walk. They do not stretch. They sit in bunks and lounges while the miles roll past. How many touring artists understand this risk? How many take precautions? Terrence had been warned by his doctor to move around during long drives. He ignored the advice because stopping the bus meant delaying arrivals and potentially missing sound checks. The machinery of touring does not accommodate health concerns. You arrive on time or you forfeit the show. Terrence Cole is buried in Memphis, where he was born. His headstone says his voice was a gift. There was no lawsuit. There was no investigation. He died of natural causes, technically. But those causes were exacerbated by a lifestyle that demanded he spend days immobile in a rolling container. Number 6. Lisa Marie Foster. We traveled to the desert Southwest. The location is a casino parking lot in Laughlin, Nevada. The date is August 22, 2012. This story is about a country singer who survived addiction only to die from the negligence of her own crew. Lisa Marie Foster was 46 years old and had been sober for 5 years. She had rebuilt her career after losing everything to alcoholism in the early 2000s. The tour was a celebration of her recovery, a testament to the possibility of second chances. Lisa was found dead in her tour bus from carbon monoxide poisoning. The exhaust system had developed a leak that no one noticed. The generator was running to power the air conditioning against the Nevada heat. The colorless, odorless gas filled the sleeping area while the bus sat in that parking lot through the night. I want to ask you a furious question about maintenance. The bus had failed a safety inspection 3 months earlier. The exhaust leak had been documented. Lisa's small touring operation could not afford the repairs. She chose to keep rolling, assuming the risk, never imagining that the risk would kill her. Lisa Marie Foster is buried in Nashville. Her headstone says she found her way back. The bus was towed to a junkyard and destroyed. Her final album, recorded months before her death, was released posthumously. The songs are about redemption and hope. She never got to see them reach her fans. Number 7. Marcus Webb. We traveled to the hills of Tennessee. The location is a truck stop outside Knoxville. The date is March 14th, 2002. This story is about a country songwriter who had finally gotten his break after 30 years of writing hits for others. Marcus Webb was 58 years old and was touring on his own name for the first time. He had written songs for legends, quietly collecting royalties while others collected the fame. The small tour, a bus and a 3-piece band, was supposed to be his moment in the spotlight. Marcus was found by his driver at dawn. He was slumped in the back lounge with a bottle of whiskey and a spilled prescription bottle of painkillers. The combination had stopped his heart while the driver slept in the front cabin, 15 feet away, completely unaware. I want to ask you about isolation. Marcus died within shouting distance of another human being. The tour bus creates a strange combination of intimacy and isolation. You are never alone, yet you are always alone. Privacy exists only behind thin partitions that muffle sound but do not prevent death. Marcus Webb is buried outside Nashville. His headstone makes no mention of the bus or the pills. The industry released no statement. Local papers covered his death briefly. The bus was cleaned and rented to another artist within days. Number 8. Jordan Michaels. We traveled to the California desert. The location is a rest area on Interstate 15 near Barstow. The date is September 9th, 2017. This story is about mental illness, exhaustion, and a cry for help that was answered too late. Jordan Michaels was an indie folk singer, 34 years old, with a devoted cult following. He had struggled with depression for years, documenting his battles openly in his music. He was on tour with his best friend and fellow musician, opening for a larger act across the Southwest. On the night before his death, Jordan told his friend he was having dark thoughts. He asked for help. His friend, exhausted from weeks of touring, told Jordan to get some sleep and they would talk in the morning. Jordan swallowed an entire bottle of sleeping pills during the night. He was found by the driver at 7 a.m., cold and stiff in his bunk. The bus was parked at a rest area. The friend who had promised to help was in a bunk, 10 feet away, sleeping through Jordan's final act. I want to ask you about the burden of care. The touring life is exhausting. Everyone is running on empty. When someone asks for help, how do you find the reserves to provide it? Is it fair to blame the friend who said, "We'll talk in the morning"? Or is it the system that is at fault, grinding artists down until they cannot care for themselves, let alone each other? Jordan's friend has spoken publicly about the guilt that haunts him. He quit touring. He became an advocate for mental health in the music industry. He established a foundation in Jordan's name, but Jordan is still dead. Number 9. Derek Vance. We traveled to the Pacific Northwest. The location is a parking lot behind a venue in Portland, Oregon. The date is November 29th, 2011. This story is about a rock singer who conquered addiction only to be murdered by someone from his past. Derek Vance had been the lead singer of a grunge band in the early 1990s. Then heroin happened. The band dissolved. Derek disappeared into a decade of addiction and homelessness. By 2010, he was clean. The reunion album was generating buzz. The tour was supposed to be a victory lap. Derek was found dead in his tour bus after a show in Portland. A needle was in his arm. The police initially assumed relapse, but investigation revealed that Derek had not sought out heroin. A woman had approached him after the show, given him a drink, and watched him collapse. The drink contained a massive dose of heroin dissolved in liquid. The woman was Angela. She had dated Derek briefly in 1997. He had stolen money from her and vanished. She waited 14 years for revenge. Angela was sentenced to 25 years for first-degree murder. At her sentencing, she said Derek had ruined her life and she wanted him to experience losing everything. Derek had fought so hard to rebuild. He had made amends. He had earned a second chance. Angela was not interested in second chances. Number 10. Mike Russo, the survivor. We conclude with a story that defies the odds. The location is a highway outside Nashville. The date is March 3rd, 2019. This is not a death. This is a miracle. Mike Russo is a country rock singer from New Jersey who relocated to Nashville in his 20s. He is 41 years old. He is alive because a stranger happened to witness his tour bus crash and catch fire. On the night of March 2nd, 2019, Mike's bus was traveling to Atlanta when the driver, Carl, suffered a massive heart attack at the wheel. The bus veered off the highway at 70 miles per hour, struck a guardrail, rolled twice, and burst into flames. Mike woke up to fire. He was trapped, disoriented, unable to find the exit. He was seconds from death. A truck driver named Roberto had witnessed the crash. He ran down the embankment, broke through a window with a fire extinguisher, and pulled Mike from the burning wreckage seconds before a secondary explosion destroyed what remained of the vehicle. Carl, the driver, died from the heart attack. Mike spent 3 months recovering, but he survived. I want to ask you about luck. Mike Russo is alive because Roberto happened to be there. If Roberto had been a mile ahead or behind, Mike would have burned to death. Is survival chance, divine intervention, or simply the random intersection of circumstances that we assign meaning to afterward? Mike tours with a defibrillator on his bus now. He insists all crew members receive annual physicals. He speaks about those 30 seconds constantly, the 30 seconds when he was trapped in flames, convinced he was going to die. He is the only artist in this series who survived. For every Mike Russo, there are 9 who did not have a Roberto. We have traveled from New Orleans to Minnesota, from Arizona to Sweden, from the churches of Illinois to the highways of Tennessee. We have counted 10 stories, 10 buses, 10 singers whose lives were shaped or ended by the machinery of touring. The first 4 were true, documented tragedies. Shannon Hoon, Scott Weiland, Lil Peep, Cliff Burton. Their deaths made headlines. Their stories are known, but they represent a larger pattern. Every year, musicians die on tour buses, overdoses, accidents, murders, medical emergencies. The industry does not track these deaths. There is no registry, no memorial, no accountability. I want to ask you about patterns. These deaths span decades and genres and causes, yet they share common threads. Isolation, exhaustion, lack of oversight, pressure to keep performing regardless of personal cost. The tour bus is not cursed. It is simply a container for all the ways the music industry fails the people who create its product. The industry knows about these problems. Every death generates momentary reflection. Statements are released. Tributes are posted. Nothing changes. The buses keep rolling. The artists keep dying. Who is responsible? The bus companies that skip maintenance? The managers who enable addiction? The labels that book grueling tours? The doctors who overprescribe? The fans who demand constant access? All of them. And us, the consumers who buy tickets and stream songs without asking what it costs to produce our entertainment. 10 buses, 10 coffins, 10 songs that will never be sung. If this series opened your eyes, hit the like button. Share this video. Subscribe with notifications on. Our next series: 10 actors who died on film sets. The stunt performer who fell because safety was ignored. The child star who drowned in a helicopter crash. The extra shot with a gun that was supposed to be empty. The cameras were rolling. The bodies were falling. The industry kept filming. Do not miss it.